Have you ever felt like you're just drowning in information? You need to get smart on something complex fast, but, where do you even start? All those articles, research papers, maybe your own scattered notes. It's just a lot. Well, you found the perfect shortcut. Welcome to the deep dive. I'm here, along with our expert guide, and we're going to distill the most important nuggets of knowledge, those key insights from a whole stack of sources. We turn that information overload into, hopefully, informed understanding. Today, our mission is to cut through the complexity surrounding data protection and GDPR compliance, and we're zooming in specifically on Portugal. Why Portugal, you might ask? Well, because it's actually a really fascinating case study. They have this unique, kind of nuanced approach to these critical privacy regulations. It makes it an incredible lens, really, to understand data privacy across Europe. We're hoping to uncover some surprising facts and get you well informed without all the overwhelm. All right, let's unpack this then. GDPR is obviously this massive framework across Europe, and sometimes it feels like everyone's still sort of getting their footing with it. But Portugal, interestingly, seems to have carved out its own path even before GDPR was fully implemented. So, what's the foundational layer here? What's their starting point for data protection?
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. What's truly foundational for Portugal, and this is key, is that their commitment to data protection isn't just, a reaction to GDPR. It runs much, much deeper. Personal data protection was actually recognized as a fundamental right way back in their 1976 constitution. That's decades before the EU even really conceived of GDPR.
Wow, 1976.
1976. So the key takeaway here is that Portugal's privacy stance isn't just about regulatory compliance. It's embedded in their constitution. It's constitutional bedrock. And that often shapes stricter interpretations than you might see in some other EU nations.
Okay, that makes sense. So, that historical context is vital.
Absolutely. Now, the GDPR itself, that became enforceable EU-wide on May 25th, 2018. Portugal then supplemented this with its own national law. That's Law 582019, which was passed in August 2019. Now, this might sound straightforward, but Portugal was actually among the last EU member states to get its national law approved.
Right, I remember reading that being one of the last. Did that create a period of significant uncertainty for businesses operating there? How did their data protection authority handle that gap?
Oh, absolutely. It did create some initial uncertainty for businesses, for sure.
Right.
But here's the important thing. The Comissão Nacional de Proteção de Dados, the CNPD, that's Portugal's independent data protection authority, they were actively enforcing the GDPR regulations throughout that whole interim period.
Yeah.
So even with the legislative delay, the commitment was there. Enforcement stayed active,
Okay.
which really just underscores Portugal's long-standing dedication to privacy. It wasn't just a quick legislative catch-up game for them.
Got it. Okay, so with that foundation laid, let's talk more about the key player here. Portugal's Data Protection Authority, the CNPD. Who are they exactly, and what makes them unique in how they operate?
Sure. So the CNPD, as I said, is Portugal's independent data protection authority. It was established way back in 1994, actually. It operates with significant administrative and financial autonomy directly under the Portuguese parliament, which is really vital for its independence. Its composition is quite balanced and robust. It's a 7-member body. You've got representatives elected by parliament. You have legal magistrates with over 10 years' experience and government appointees. So this structure really ensures a diverse range of expertise while, safeguarding its independence from direct political influence.
And what about resources? Do we know how well-funded or staffed they are?
Yeah, we do have some figures to give you an idea of their operational scale. As of 2023, the CNPD had an annual budget of approximately $2.98 million
Okay.
and a staff of just 29 people.
Wow, 29 staff. That sounds like a pretty compact team for an authority covering a whole country and, such complex regulations. Does that mean they have to be super strategic in their enforcement, maybe target specific areas?
That's a really sharp observation. And yes, indeed, this relatively lean operation actually proves something crucial. The CNPD is highly efficient and very strategically focused. They manage to turn those, let's say, modest resources into very real, very impactful enforcement on the ground. They're also actively modernizing. There are plans to implement electronic procedures, specifically to reduce case processing times.
Ah, that makes sense.
And that will be a significant game changer, right? It'll allow them to process complaints and investigations much faster, boosting their efficiency and responsiveness even more. Under GDPR, the CNPD's role has really evolved quite dramatically. It shifted from what was primarily a notification-based system where organizations would just sort of inform them about data processing to one of active supervision and pretty robust enforcement. They have the power to conduct investigations, issue corrective measures, and importantly, impose some substantial fines.
Right.
This makes data protection enforcement in Portugal something organizations just can't ignore.
Okay, so practically speaking, then, for companies operating in Portugal, what are the core GDPR requirements they absolutely need to get right? And where do those unique Portuguese specifics really bite?
Well, at its core, data processing in Portugal, just like elsewhere under GDPR, requires a lawful basis. You need a reason. Consent is just one of 6 possibilities, and organizations really need to carefully assess which ground applies. Is it legitimate interests, contractual necessity, a legal obligation, and so on. What's fascinating here, though, is the CNPD's particularly restrictive view on using consent as the lawful basis for employee data processing.
Ah, okay. Why is that?
Well, it's due to the inherent power imbalance in that employment relationship. The CNPD generally feels employees can't freely give consent in that context.
That's a really critical nuance about employee consent. So if consent is often, let's say, problematic there because of that power imbalance, what are the most common alternative lawful bases that organizations in Portugal are successfully using for employee data? Are there pitfalls to watch out for?
That's an excellent question. Yeah, given the CNPD's stance, organizations typically rely on performance of a contract,
Mm,
for things like payroll data
makes sense.
or legal obligation for tax or Social Security information. Sometimes legitimate interest comes into play, but usually only when it's very carefully balanced and documented. It's almost always seen as a last resort for employee data.
And the pitfall.
The main pitfall with legitimate interest is misapplying it. It requires a really strict necessity test and a very thorough balancing act against the employee's fundamental rights. And that's often difficult to justify, given those power dynamics we mentioned.
Right. Okay. What else?
Transparency obligations are also paramount. Organizations absolutely must provide clear, accessible information about their data processing activities. And here's where Portuguese specificity really comes in strongly. There's a significant emphasis on communicating in Portuguese for local data subjects.
Ah, okay. Not just translation, but true understanding.
Exactly. It's about ensuring genuine understanding and accessibility. So privacy notices have to detail the purposes of processing, the data retention periods, who receives the data, and all the rights available to data subjects very clearly.
Hmm.
And speaking of rights, data subject rights are a cornerstone of GDPR compliance everywhere, and Portugal's no different. The right to access, rectification, erasure, portability, objection. The CNPD particularly emphasizes the right to information. They've frequently sanctioned organizations for having inadequate privacy notices or for failing to respond properly to data subject requests.
So bottom line for organizations there?
Bottom line is, those subtle differences in interpretation, especially around things like employee consent and the language requirement, they can lead to significant compliance challenges if you're not careful.
Okay. Now, let's zero in on a particularly tricky area, special categories of data, sensitive stuff. Portugal seems to have some very specific provisions here, and I know there have been some high-profile cases. What makes this area so critical in Portugal?
Yeah, processing special categories of data, think health data, biometric data, religious beliefs, things like that. It faces really heightened scrutiny in Portugal, understandably because of the deeply sensitive nature of the information. There was a landmark case back in 2018. A Portuguese hospital was fined a pretty substantial 400,000 process.
Right, I remember hearing about that one.
And that case powerfully underscored the critical importance of implementing robust access controls and really sticking to data minimization principles, especially within healthcare settings.
Yeah.
It was a very clear message from the CNPD about how seriously they take protecting that kind of sensitive information.
Okay. And what about biometrics? You mentioned that.
Right. Biometric data usage, especially in employment contexts, also has specific rules. There's Article 28.6 of Law 58/2019. It allows for biometric data processing for, say, attendance control or accessing premises. But, and this is the crucial point, it mandates that only biometric representations be used.
Biometric representations, what does that mean in practice as
Right.
opposed to the original data?
Exactly. It means they cannot store the actual raw biometric data, like a full fingerprint image or a direct template that could potentially be reverse engineered back to the original.
Ah.
Instead, they have to convert it into something like an irreversible numerical hash or code that's the representation. This ensures that even if there's a data breach, the raw biometric data itself can't be retrieved or used to identify someone outside that specific system.
That's fascinating. So it's Portugal's way of balancing the tech use with privacy.
Precisely. It's a careful balance between enabling legitimate business uses and protecting fundamental privacy rights.
What about other sensitive data, like religious or political beliefs?
Well, for those categories like religious or political data and other sensitive types, you generally need explicit consent or another very specific legal basis under GDPR Article 9. What this signals really is the CNPD's strong willingness to challenge organizations that fail to adequately justify processing this type of data. The 2021 census case is a prime example here. The National Statistics Institute received that massive 4.3 million fine.
Wow, 4.3 million, that's huge.
It is, and a key reason was that they didn't conduct proper assessments before collecting sensitive data on such a large scale. So these concrete examples, these large fines, they really illustrate the real-world consequences of noncompliance, particularly with sensitive data. They serve as powerful aha moments for sure.
Definitely. So, okay, when organizations are trying to get this right internally, who's the champion? Who leads the charge for data protection inside the company? And how do they proactively assess risks? I assume data protection officers, DPOs, and data protection impact assessments, DPIAs, are crucial here, right?
That's spot on, absolutely. The appointment of data protection officers, or DPOs, in Portugal has specific criteria that actually go a bit beyond GDPR's baseline requirements. For instance, all public authorities and bodies in Portugal are mandated to appoint a DPO. That's regardless of their size or processing activities. It's just required.
Okay, for all public bodies.
Right.
And the private sector.
For the private sector, a DPO is required if their core activities involve regular and systematic monitoring of data subjects on a large scale, or if they process special categories of data on a large scale. And it's worth noting, the CNPD interprets core activities quite broadly. It covers operations essential to an organization's goals, not just, say, their primary business functions.
Okay. And what about the DPO themselves? What are the rules around their role?
Well, the independence of the DPO is really strongly emphasized. They must possess expert knowledge of data protection law and practices. Critically, they cannot be dismissed or penalized for performing their duties. They must report directly to the highest management level. And they also need to avoid conflicts of interest. This means they generally can't hold other positions within the organization that determine the purposes and means of data processing.
That conflict of interest clause sounds like it could be a real practical challenge for some organizations, maybe smaller ones, where people wear multiple hats. Does it limit who can actually be the DPO?
It absolutely can be a practical challenge, you're right, particularly for smaller and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs. It usually means the DPO typically cannot be someone like the head of IT or the head of HR or even the CEO, because those roles inherently involve determining how and why data is processed.
Right.
So this often necessitates either hiring a dedicated DPO, someone specifically for that role, or outsourcing the DPO function to an external specialist, which of course can be an additional investment. But it truly emphasizes the importance the regulators place on the DPO's independent oversight function.
Okay. And the DPIAs, the impact assessments.
Right, data protection impact assessments, or DPIAs. These are indeed critical tools, especially for any processing activities deemed high risk. The CNPD has even published specific guidance on this. It's Regulation 798/2018, listing specific types of operations that definitively require a DPIA.
Like what, for example?
Things like systematic monitoring of publicly accessible areas on a large scale, processing data concerning vulnerable subjects like children or employees, large-scale processing of sensitive data, or using innovative new technologies where the risks aren't fully understood yet. And the expectation is for these DPIAs to be thorough. It's not just a tick box exercise. They need to genuinely assess the risks and the planned mitigation measures.
Okay, and what happens if that DPIA, even after looking at mitigations, still reveals really high risks? Risks the organization maybe can't fully address on its own? Do they have to go to the CNPD before they start? What does that involve?
Yes, exactly. If a DPIA reveals high residual risks that remain high even after considering mitigation measures, then the organization is required to consult the CNPD before starting that processing activity.
Yeah.
This prior consultation basically means submitting the DPIA report to the CNPD, explaining the situation, the unmitigated risks, and why they believe they need to proceed. The CNPD typically responds within 8 weeks, although complex cases might take a bit longer. They might provide advice or even prohibit the processing if the risks are deemed unacceptable.
Got it.
So yeah, this whole process clarifies those internal roles, the DPO, the assessment process, which are just crucial for proactive compliance. It shows how organizations really need to build privacy into their operations right from the start, not just tack it on as an afterthought.
Right. Now, shifting gears a bit, in our super interconnected world, data rarely stays put in one country, does it? What's Portugal's specific stance on cross-border data transfers? And what do the enforcement trends tell us about how seriously the CMPD is taking compliance, especially with these international transfers?
Yeah, international data transfers from Portugal are taken very seriously, governed by Chapter 5 of the GDPR. And that huge 4.3 million fine against the National Statistics Institute we mentioned earlier. A significant part of that was actually related to unauthorized transfers of census data to the United States.
Ah, okay, so the transfer itself was a major issue, too.
Exactly. It really showcases the CNPD's active stance on ensuring international transfers are done lawfully. For transferring data to countries outside the UEA that don't have an adequacy decision from the European Commission, organizations in Portugal frequently rely on standard contractual clauses, or SCCs.
Those are the pre-approved contract terms, right?
Yes, precisely.
Yeah.
They're pre-approved legal agreements designed to provide safeguards for the data. But, crucially, following recent European court rulings, the CNPD also expects organizations to conduct what are called transfer impact assessments, or TIAs.
CIAs, what are those?
A TIA is essentially a detailed evaluation an organization must perform before relying on SCCs. They have to assess whether the legal framework and surveillance practices in the destination country might undermine the protections actually provided by those SCCs in practice.
So it's an extra layer of due diligence.
It is. It adds complexity, but it's considered essential now for ensuring real protection when data leaves the EU.
Okay. Now, looking at the enforcement numbers, you mentioned the CMPD issued, what was it, 90 fines totaling around 560,000 euro in 2023?
That's right, about 559,950.
Now, while that's definitely a significant amount, especially for the companies involved, it might seem maybe modest compared to some of the massive nine-figure fines we sometimes hear about in other larger European countries. What does that number really signal about the CNPD's enforcement strategy? Is it less aggressive or just different?
That's a great point to raise. While the total monetary value might seem lower than some headline-grabbing fines elsewhere, it actually represents a clear trend of increasing enforcement activity and, importantly, growing sophistication in the CMPD's approach. It signals that they are being consistently active, applying fines across a wider range of often smaller and medium-sized infringements. They aren't just waiting around for the massive high-profile cases.
So more consistent, broader enforcement rather than just headline hunting.
Exactly. Their key focus areas for fines have consistently been things like transparency violations, inadequate privacy notices, for example, insufficient security measures, and unlawful data processing, like not having a proper legal basis. These are really foundational issues for GDPR compliance. And the CNPD's sanctioning approach is also quite transparent. They publicly state they consider multiple factors when deciding on a fine. Things like the nature and gravity of the infringement, whether it was intentional or just negligent, any steps the company took to mitigate damage, the degree of cooperation they showed with the authority during the investigation, and of course, any previous infringements.
So they incentivize good behavior and cooperation.
Absolutely. It strongly incentivizes proactive compliance and cooperating fully if an investigation does occur. So, yeah, these details are really vital for anyone involved in international business or just trying to understand the actual financial risks of noncompliance in Portugal. It's very real.
Okay, so beyond just, avoiding those fines, building a strong data protection culture seems absolutely key. What best practices are really emerging in Portugal to cultivate this kind of privacy-aware culture? And are there unique considerations for different industries operating there?
Yeah, building that robust data protection culture is essential. It really moves beyond just basic legal compliance to embedding privacy deep into an organization's operational DNA, how it thinks and acts. An absolute key factor is leadership commitment. You need senior management actively championing privacy initiatives, allocating proper resources, maybe even including data protection metrics in executive dashboards or board updates. That top-down approach ensures privacy gets the consistent attention it deserves.
Right, it can't just be a compliance checklist item.
Exactly. Employee training is also crucial. And importantly, it should be conducted regularly and, as we mentioned before, in Portuguese for local staff. This helps ensure everyone genuinely understands their responsibilities and knows how to handle practical role-specific scenarios they might encounter. Another really important best practice is privacy by design. This means organizations build privacy safeguards right from the earliest stages of planning any new project, product, or service, rather than trying to, bolt them on later.
Like for new software or systems?
Yes. For instance, if you're developing business automation services, the automated processes themselves must incorporate privacy safeguards right from their inception. And finally, regular internal audits are critical. You need programs to verify that the policies you have written down actually translate into practice on the ground and to identify areas where improvement is needed.
Okay. And you mentioned sector-specific nuances earlier. For example, in financial services, you talked about balancing GDPR with anti-money laundering rules. That sounds like a complex tightrope walk, especially with all the new fintech innovations happening. How did they manage that?
It absolutely is a complex balance. Financial services, and this is intensified by fintech, have to reconcile robust data protection under GDPR with really stringent anti-money laundering, or AML, and counter-terrorist financing obligations. This means sometimes sharing certain customer data might be legally required for AML purposes, and that legal obligation can override some privacy considerations under GDPR.
Ah,
The challenge, though, is ensuring that only the strictly necessary data is processed for AML, that it's handled securely and transparently, and that they adhere to both sets of regulations without unnecessary overcollection or retention. It's a fine line.
I can imagine. What about other sectors like healthcare or education?
Well, healthcare providers, as we discussed, face that heightened scrutiny due to sensitive health data. They also have to comply with specific national provisions, like Law 1-2005, which deals specifically with genetic and health information. That adds an extra layer of requirements for robust access controls, particularly for medical and genetic data, going beyond even standard GDPR.
Right.
Educational institutions dealing with data about minors need to carefully navigate Portugal's age of digital consent, which is 13 years for information society services. They have to ensure they have appropriate parental involvement where needed. And then for e-commerce and digital services, common challenges revolve around clear consent management for cookies and tracking, handling cross-border data flows correctly, and implementing those clear consent mechanisms while also, trying to run their business effectively using things like SEO optimization strategies.
So it really varies by sector.
It really does. What this shows is that for businesses in Portugal, privacy isn't just a one-size-fits-all burden. It's actually a nuanced competitive advantage, demanding tailored strategies that respect these sector-specific regulations and build trust.
Okay, so with all these unique facets, the constitutional history, the specific laws, the CMPD's approach, and these evolving requirements, what does the crystal ball tell us? How is Portugal's data protection landscape likely to evolve in the coming years? What's next?
Well, the Portuguese data protection landscape is definitely not static. It's continuing to evolve. One major area is an increased focus from the CNPD on artificial intelligence, on AI applications. They're looking particularly at issues around transparency, fairness, the need for human oversight, and importantly, the ability of AI systems to explain their decision-making logic explainability.
Ah, the black box problem.
Exactly. So Portuguese organizations developing things like AI agent solutions, for example, will likely face specific scrutiny in this area.
What else is on the horizon?
We also need to keep a close eye on the upcoming e-privacy regulation at the EU level. This will eventually replace the current e-privacy directive from 2002. It's expected to bring new, likely stricter requirements impacting things like cookie consent banners, rules around direct marketing, and the confidentiality of electronic communications. Preparing for those changes now will be crucial for Portuguese organizations. There's also the ongoing trend of enhanced European cooperation between data protection authorities.
Right.
The CMPD's participation in joint EU operations, like coordinated investigations, means that their ability to tackle complex cross-border violations is becoming increasingly sophisticated. And finally, there's an emerging consideration, which is really interesting: sustainability in data processing.
Sustainability. How does that relate to data protection? That sounds like a fascinating link. What does environmental impact of data storage and processing even mean for a company, practically? Are we talking energy use?
Yes, exactly. It primarily refers to the significant energy consumption of data centers, servers, and all the hardware involved in processing and storing vast amounts of data.
Right.
So the drive for data minimization, for example, only collecting and keeping the data you truly need, isn't just about privacy compliance anymore. It's also increasingly seen as a way to reduce the sheer volume of data being stored, which in turn reduces the energy footprint and the associated carbon emissions.
Interesting. So less data equals greener operations.
In a sense, yes. It's about designing data systems and processes with environmental efficiency in mind from the start. The CNPD and other regulators are starting to consider this as part of broader responsible data governance.
Wow.
So yeah, all these trends, AI scrutiny, e-privacy, EU cooperation, sustainability, they will undeniably continue to shape the digital economy and the regulatory landscape in Portugal. It shows a kind of proactive regulatory foresight, linking data privacy to these broader societal and technological concerns.
So, after diving deep into all of this, what does it all really mean for you, our listener, as someone just trying to navigate this complex world of information and privacy?
Well, I think the key takeaway is that GDPR compliance in Portugal, while complex, is not just a legal obligation you have to tick off. It's actually becoming a significant business opportunity. Organizations that truly embrace comprehensive privacy programs that go beyond the bare minimum, they can do more than just avoid those substantial fines we talked about. They can build deep, lasting trust with their customers, their employees, and their partners.
And that trust is valuable.
Incredibly valuable. That trust becomes a powerful differentiator, helping them stand out in both the domestic Portuguese market and on the international stage. So maybe a final thought to leave you with. Consider how this intersection we've discussed of deeply rooted constitutional rights going back decades, specific national laws layering on top of GDPR, an active regulator, and all this evolving technology, how all that coming together in a single country like Portugal might influence how you approach data privacy, whether it's in your own personal life or within your organization, really, no matter where you happen to be. It's a compelling case study.